having me. Well, I agree with the overall New York Times assessment that the Iranians are only facing bad options. If they don't respond at all, this is going to be perceived as weakness, as sort of that unconditional surrender that President Trump had asked for. And it can potentially bring more of the same in the long term and even short term by the Israelis, by the Americans. This is going to be how Iran is going to be dealt with from their viewpoint. If they respond, and that response is seen as an escalation into a full-on war, then there's no winning against the U.S. military, obviously. So I think we're going to see potentially something in between. Right now, the messaging coming out of Tehran is that maybe this attack wasn't as destructive as it's being portrayed. Oh, we've moved some of the stockpile, or the damage is not irreparable. And that sounds like they want to calibrate their response in a way that it is a response, but is also not seen as a major escalation. So potentially maybe attacking some U.S. interests in the region without a fatality of American personnel or service members.
Trita, even though the Ayatollah has been in power for many, many years, I don't think a lot of Americans know that much about him. So help us to understand who he is and what his thought process might be as he makes this decision.
I think the first thing to keep in mind that he is about 87 years old. And I think at a stage in his life in which he does not have the ability to make fast decisions on par with what is happening in his environment right now. Moreover, because of the manner in which the Israelis have managed to penetrate a lot of Iran's communications, the Iranians are at this point apparently not communicating at all electronically, which means that everything is even slower again. So that's, I think, point number one when it comes to him. I think it's also very important to understand that when many of us read about the tragedy of U.S.-Iran relations and the many instances in which the two sides have opposed each other, harmed each other, or felt betrayed by each other, going all the way back to 1953 or the 1979 revolution, the hostage-taking, the U.S.'s support for Saddam Hussein throughout the Iran-Iraq war, including with the chemical weapons. He has lived through almost all of those events from 1979 and onward. So his deep suspicion of the United States, I think, is essentially unparalleled and has been a key reason as to why, even when both sides actually did have an interest and a desire to move forward in a more constructive, positive direction, he was oftentimes, but not always, a very strong force against that. Occasionally he gave in, as he did with the JCPOA in 2015. But overall, I think he feels that he's been vindicated in his suspicion, particularly mindful of the fact that the Trump administration essentially is bragging that they were pretending to pursue diplomacy. It was all a ruse. It was all aimed at lulling the Iranians into a false sense of security, while in reality, the military plans were moving forward.
Trita, what do we know about what's going on the ground with the Iranian people? There's been a lot of conversations among supporters of Trump, Donald Trump, that what was needed was some devastating blow like what we just saw to destabilize the regime. But what do we know about what the Iranian people know and what they're doing?
First of all, I'm not so sure this was that devastating blow. It clearly was a very strong blow, but we don't know yet exactly what the damage to the program has been. One of the key things that to look for is that there doesn't seem to be any spread of radiation at the Fordo site, which suggests that the actual core crown jewel of the nuclear program, which is their enriched uranium, had already been taken out of Fordo. This is what the Iranians already had said, but I don't think many people believe them, and it's still unclear whether it's true or not. But the absence of radiation seems to suggest that that may be true, which then means that it's somewhere else and it's not destroyed. I think a far more devastating blow psychologically was what happened in the first 12 to 18 hours when the Israelis began the attack, 2 days before negotiations were supposed to take place, because of the manner in which they managed to execute and kill a large number of top Iranian officials. That was, I think, a huge psychological blow to them, but they regrouped already within 18 to 24 hours and started attacking Israel in return. So I don't think they are as weak as many people in Washington may want to believe that they are. Doesn't mean that they won't collapse, and one day they will. But I think we also should be clear about one thing. It is far more likely that the next regime will come out of hardline elements from within this existing regime, rather than that Iran will be taken over by peaceful NGOs as a result of a regime change done through warfare. That doesn't mean that the Iranian people are not, eagerly looking towards establishing democracy in their country. It's just that the realities of power are not such that a regime change under these circumstances is likely to lead to democracy. It's more likely to lead to a much, much more hardline government in Iran than what currently is there.
We saw that quote, Nagar, in the New York Times about that it is could be likely to lead to the collapse or years of instability, a fate like that of Iraq and Afghanistan. Are there parallels and are there lessons to be learned from that?
Absolutely. I would also add Libya and Syria. So, U.S. involvement militarily in the region has never resulted, as I agree with Trita, in more democracy and stability. In fact, in search of big monsters, the U.S. has been inadvertently helping smaller monsters coming out of that sort of situation of instability, insecurity, and more conflict. And I think the same goes for Iran. Now the Iranian people, even the ones that are staunchly opposed to the government, to the status quo, to the regime, are coming out with a unified anti-war message because they have seen the devastating impacts of the war across the neighborhood, in the region, and then also on themselves. From the first day of the Israeli attack, even though this has been framed as an attack on Iran's nuclear program, there have been civilian casualties. In fact, the majority of the casualties have been civilians right now. It's somewhere between 400 to 600 dead, a couple thousand injured, and many, many people displaced also, with evacuation orders coming in the middle of the night on social media, Israeli social media, and then attacks coming right after. Apartment buildings have been attacked, car bombs going off, and the airspace has been closed. People are trying to flee the country from land borders now without really plan on where they go and how long this is going to drag. So I think Iranians, at least even the ones who are opposed to the status quo for very good reasons, economic, political, social reasons, grievances that have not been addressed by the government, as we see protest after protest, and in a repressive domestic space, they now feel like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. These sort of freedom bombs are coming from the sky onto their homes, not really bringing any freedom yet, but more death and destruction, and then also a government that has been repressing their needs and their grievances for years.
Nagar Mortazavi, Trita Parsi, thank you both.